Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Withdrawal Bill, second reading.
Thank you. Now, good, indeed. That's helpful. I call to move the second reading, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was glad to hear the now. I was worried for a second. I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, when I introduced the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Bill earlier this year, I said that bill was just the beginning of a process to ensure the decision made by the people in June last year is honoured. And today we begin the next step in the historic process of honouring that decision. Put simply, this bill is an essential step. Whilst it does not take us out of the European Union, that's a matter for the Article 50 process, it does ensure that on the day we leave, businesses know where they stand, workers' rights are upheld, and consumers remain protected. This bill is vital to ensuring that as we leave, we do so in an orderly manner. Let me start with a brief summary of the bill before going on to set out its key provisions in more depth. The bill is designed to provide maximum possible legal certainty and continuity whilst restoring control to the United Kingdom. It does so in three broad steps. First, it removes from the statute book the key legislation passed by this Parliament in 1972, the European Communities Act. That Act gave European Union law supreme status over law made in this country. It is therefore right that it be removed from our statute book on the day the UK leaves the European Union, bringing to an end the supremacy of European law over laws made here in the United Kingdom. Second, the bill takes a snapshot of the body of EU law which currently forms part of the United Kingdom legal system and ensures that it will continue to apply in the United Kingdom after we leave. This is to ensure that wherever possible, the same rules and laws will apply the day after exit as they did before. Without this step, a large part of our law would fall away when the European Communities Act is repealed. But simply preserving European Union law is not enough. There will be many areas where the preserved law does not work as it should. So as its third key element, the bill provides ministers in this Parliament and in the devolved legislatures with powers to make statutory instruments to address the problems that would arise when we leave the European Union. These powers allow ministers to make those changes to ensure the statute book works on day one. This will be a major shared undertaking across the United Kingdom. In a moment. Well, I'll give way to both of them in a few minutes. Following this, it will be for the United Kingdom legislators to pass laws and for the United Kingdom courts to adjudicate those laws. Mr. Speaker, the bill enables us to leave the European Union in the smoothest and most orderly way possible. It's the most significant piece of legislation to be considered by this House for some time, and it will rightly be scrutinised clause by clause, line by line, on the floor of this House. And I stand ready to listen to those who offer improvements to the bill in the spirit of preparing our statute book for withdrawal from the European Union. The Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras likes to remind me of my past incarnation as a backbenchers champion and my dedication to holding the government to account. Mr. Speaker, I've not changed my views one jot. Let me be clear. This bill does only what is necessary for a smooth exit and to provide stability. However, as I've repeatedly said, I welcome and encourage contributions from those who approach the task in good faith and in a spirit of collaboration. All of us as legislators have a shared interest in making this bill a success and in the national interest. I give way to the honourable gentleman who rose first.
Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. He mentioned in his opening remarks that the bill gives ministers the power to change laws through statutory instruments and in other mechanisms. Does that include changing laws to devolved administrations?
Well, I'll come to the detail of that later in this speech, in some detail, and how that process will work. So, if you'll be patient. The honourable gentleman was second.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Will he take this opportunity to confirm that the government will not use this bill to make policy changes?
Again, I'll detail it in some detail, but the primary aim of the bill, there's one exception to this, but the primary aim of the bill is to maintain policy as it is now. The only exception to that is under the withdrawal arrangements, and that will be time determined and limited. And I'll detail that again in a second. I'll give way one more time. There we
go. To the Secretary of State. George Osborne, in his headline in the Evening Standard last night, referred to the Secretary of State's approach as rule by decree. Why is the Secretary of State taking this high-handed approach to the practices of this Parliament?
Well, I don't read the Evening Standard, I have to tell you. And it sounds like with good reason. And I have to tell him that if I'm going to take lectures on rule by decree, it won't be from the editor of the Evening Standard. Now, the key point... One more time.
Right, honourable friend, confirm that if the government wishes to make a change by statutory instrument, that is a parliamentary process. It will be entirely in Parliament's control. And it's a synthetic nonsense to suggest that ministers are bypassing Parliament.
He's entirely right. It's a point I'll elaborate on later. And the editor of the Evening Standard should know that from his own experience. Now, the key point of this bill is to avoid significant and serious gaps in our statute book. The bill ensures consumers can be clear about their protections, employees can be clear about their rights, and businesses can be clear about the rules that regulate their trade. Workers' rights, consumer and environmental protections will be enforceable to the UK courts, which are renowned the world over. The bill provides certainty as to how the law applies after we leave the European Union, and ensures individuals and businesses can continue to find redress when problems arise. And in a moment, and of course, without this bill, all of these things are put at risk. The bill must be on the statute book in good time ahead of our withdrawal, so that the statutory instruments my right honourable friend referred to that will flow from the bill can be made in time for exit day. The House will have time to look at them, and so we are in a position to take control of our laws from day one. The bill provides a clear basis for our negotiation with the European Union by ensuring continuity and clarity in our laws, without prejudice to the ongoing negotiations. Without this legislation, a smooth and orderly exit is impossible. The shape of any interim period will need to be determined by the negotiations, but we cannot await the completion of negotiations before ensuring that there is legal certainty and continuity at the point of our exit. To do so will be reckless. The honourable lady was first, I think.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Could he confirm his view that in choosing to not transpose the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, that it will have no impact on the actual rights of the British people, their interpretation or their enforcement in the courts?
Well, if she remembers, I'm going to come again to this later, but if she remembers when the White Paper was presented to this House, I did actually say to her right honourable friend, my opposite number, on the opposite benches, that if there were any powers that were missing, to come to the government, tell the House, and we will put that right. And that, I haven't had a single comment since on that. So I'll make some progress now, and I'll give way a little later. I'm very conscious of the point that was made by the Father of the House, that we are going to have tight time on this at least day, and I'll give way as much as reasonably, but I don't want to dilate too long. If you'll forgive me for the moment. But, Mr. Speaker, let me now talk the House through the bill's main provisions. The first clause of the bill repeals the European Communities Act on the day we leave the European Union, ending the supremacy of EU law in the UK and preventing new EU law from automatically flowing into UK law after that point. When the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson led a debate here in May 1967 on the question of the United Kingdom's entry of the European communities, he said, "It's important to realise that community law is mainly concerned with industrial and commercial activities with corporate bodies rather than private individuals. By far the greater part of our domestic law would remain unchanged after entry. I think the passage of time has shown that he was mistaken. European Union law touches on all aspects of our lives in a far wider way than the drafters of the European Communities Act could have envisaged. This means the bill we have before us today has a difficult task. It must rebuild United Kingdom law in a way that makes sense outside the European Union. In a moment. To do this, the first step the bill takes is to preserve all the domestic law we have made to implement our EU obligations. This mainly means preserving thousands of statutory instruments that have been made under the European Communities Act, with subjects ranging from aeroplane noise to zoo licensing. It also extends to preserving any other domestic law that fulfills our European Union obligations or otherwise relates to the European Union. In a moment, equally, the bill converts European Union law, principally EU regulations, all 12,000 of them, into domestic law on exit day. It also ensures that rights in the EU treaties that are directly effective, that's rights that are sufficiently clear, precise and unconditional they can be relied on in court by an individual, continue to be available in UK law under the bill. I've no doubt there is much about EU law that could be improved, and I know this Parliament will over time look to improve it. But that is not the purpose, including him, I think, the person who laughed just there. But that's not the purpose of this bill. This bill simply brings European Union law into UK law, ensuring that wherever possible the rules and laws are the same after exit as before. Just as important as the text of EU law is the interpretation of that law. For that reason, in a moment, the bill ensures that any question as to the meaning of retained law is to be decided on in UK courts in accordance with the Court of Justice's case law and retain general principles of European Union law as they stood on exit day. This approach maximises stability by ensuring that the meaning of the law does not change overnight, and only the Supreme Court and the High Court of Justiciary in Scotland will be able to depart from retained EU case law. They will do so on the same basis they depart from their own case law. Any other approach would either actively cause uncertainty or fossilise EU case law forever. Future decisions of the Court of Justice will not bind our courts, but our courts will have discretion to have regard to such decisions if they consider it relevant and appropriate to do so, in just the same way that our courts might at the moment refer to cases in other common law jurisdictions such as Australia or Canada. The honourable gentleman's been patient.
I thank him for giving way. Given the scale of the task that he is setting out in his introduction to this bill and the huge impact that our relationship with the EU has on every aspect of our lives, our economy, our workers' rights, our environmental rights, our relationships on security and law, can he explain why we are only getting 8 days to discuss this bill in committee when the bill that took us in had 22 and the Maastricht Treaty had 20?
Well, the first thing I'd say to him, I mean, 8 days is quite a long time in this but perhaps the most relevant comparison is the Lisbon Treaty, which actually recreated, yes it is, because it recreated the European law on a major basis. This doesn't do that. This does not aim to change law, with a tiny exception, which I'll come back to. This does not aim to change law. This aims to maintain. It is primarily technical in that respect, and aims to maintain the laws that we currently have. And if he sees that as any different, then I will give way to it. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Trouble with relying on secondary legislation is that secondary legislation is unamendable and only gets 1.5 hours debate. Would it not, in particular, in relation to any secondary legislation brought through under Section 9 of this bill, be sensible to allow a new form of secondary legislation where you can amend and you have substantial debate?
Well, in essence, the aim of the bill, remember, is to translate European Union law into UK law, and to make sure that there are no problems arising, whether it means references to bodies that we no longer are subordinate to, whether it means the language is different, whether it applies to reciprocal rights. Many of this will be very straightforward and relatively simple. But the point you should look at in the legislation is that it seeks to make the type of secondary legislation, whether it's an affirmative or negative resolution, proportionate to that. If he wants to talk about this issue further, I'm happy to talk to him. I'm not going to reinvent the Constitution at this dispatch box. But I've said before, I'll happily give way. I'll give way to him.
conclusion should the electorate draw about respect from democracy from other parties' refusal to give this bill a second reading?
I'm not going to presume ill intent from the start. What I say to everybody in this House is the electorate will draw their own judgment. I won't draw the electorate will draw their own judgment as to whether people are addressing this in a sensible way to maintain the rights of British citizens and to maintain the continuity of British law in a way which will enable that to happen in good time for our departure from the Union, which is after all a fixed date, or whether they're simply using it as a cynical political exercise. It's not a decision for me to make, it is a decision for the electorate to make, and they make it, they will. Now I will make some progress now. Overall then, not for a moment. Overall then, the bill provides, in a moment, overall then, the bill provides for a very significant continuity in the law. But there are some elements that simply, in a moment, they simply not make sense if they remain on the UK statute book once we have left the EU and in the years and decades to come. It would not make sense, for example, for the bill to preserve the supremacy of EU law, or to make the preserved EU law supreme over future legislation passed by this Parliament. Laws passed in these two houses after exit day will take precedence over retained EU law. Mr. Speaker, we also do not believe it will make sense to retain the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Charter only applies to member states when acting within the scope of EU law. We will not be a member state, nor will be acting within the scope of EU law once we leave the European Union. As I said to the House when I published the white paper on the bill, the Charter catalogues the rights found under EU law, which will be brought into UK law by the bill. It is not, and never was, the source of those rights. Those rights have their origins elsewhere in domestic law or relate to international treaties or obligations which the UK remains party to. For example, the ECHR. So let me be clear. The absence of the Charter will not affect the substantive rights available in the UK. And I've said at this dispatch box before, as I said earlier, if members opposite or anyone in the House, and I'm thinking my right honourable friend, I'll come to him in a minute, anyone in this House find a substantive right that's not carried forward into UK law, they should say so, and we will deal with it. In the several months since I said that, since I said that, no one has yet brought my attention to right we've missed. Now, it may be that will happen in the next 2 minutes, but I'll start with the Honourable Lady and then I'll come to my honourable friend.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He will know that the key issue is not what ministers say the aim of the bill is, but what the actual powers are that are contained in it. Yep. So can he tell the House what safeguards are there anywhere in the bill, in statute, that would prevent ministers in future using Clause 7 or Clause 9 or Clause 17 to completely rewrite extradition policy in the demise of the European arrest warrant without coming back to Parliament through primary legislation?
I'm going to come back to the details in a moment, but there are a number of limitations, one of which is that we cannot impinge on a Human Rights Act, which goes straight to the point that she was raising. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I understand his point about the Charter, because I agree with him that general principles in the Charter should be identical. Although that does suggest, one does raise the question as why the Charter should go in those circumstances. But it says quite clearly in Schedule 1 that after this, we have done this, there is no right of action in domestic law on or after exit day based on a failure to comply with any of the general principles of EU law. He must agree that that means that the right of the individual to challenge on the basis that the principle of EU law imported into our law by this Act will no longer be possible. In our own courts, forget about the European Court of Justice, in our courts. And that seems to me to be a marked diminution in the rights of the individual and of corporate entities.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have my old and dear right honourable friend, I'm going to have a difference of opinion. We will, in fact, put in the library a letter on this specific issue, which we've already sent. But before we go there, the simple truth is that these laws, these rights, I should say, but he should know as well as anybody, these rights originate from a whole series of origins. Some of them British common law, some of them EU law, which we'll bring in ourselves, and some of them the European Convention on Human Rights, which you will note we are continuing with. So all of these things will provide those undertakings. Why on earth we need an extra layer of declaratory law, I do not know. It was brought in under the Blair government. Perhaps that explains why it was there. Now, Mr. Speaker, no, for the moment, in a moment, I will make some progress and I'll come back to the lady. Mr. Speaker, the conversion of EU law into UK law is an essential measure to ensure the UK leaves the EU in the smoothest way possible. However, that action alone is not enough to ensure that the statute book continues to function. Many laws will no longer make sense outside the EU. If we're only to convert EU law into UK law, our statute book would still be broken. Many laws would oblige UK individuals, firms or public authorities to continue to engage with the European Union in a way that's both absurd and impossible for a country that's not within the European Union. Other laws would leave the European Union institutions as key public authorities in the United Kingdom, a role they'd not be able to perform or fulfil. The problems which would arise without making these changes range from minor inconveniences to the disruption of vital services we all rely on every day. So in practical terms, this ranges from a public authority being required to submit reports on water quality to the European Union to actually causing disruption to the city by removing the supervision of credit rating agencies entirely. It's essential that these issues are addressed before we leave the European Union, or we'll be in breach of our duty as legislators to provide a functioning and clear set of laws for our citizens. That's why the bill provides a power to correct problems that arise in retained EU law as a result of our withdrawal from the European Union. This is Clause 7 of the bill, the so-called correcting power. Now, unlike Section 2.2, and this goes straight to the point the Right Honourable Lady raised, unlike Section 2.2 of the European Communities Act, which can be used to do almost anything to the statute book to implement EU law, the correcting power is a limited power. It can only be used to correct problems with the statute book arising directly from our withdrawal from the European Union. Ministers cannot use it simply to replace European Union laws they do not like. It's designed to allow us to replicate as closely as possible existing European Union laws and regimes in a domestic context. It's also restricted so it cannot, for example, be used to create serious criminal offences, amend the Human Rights Act, impose or increase taxation. And we've ensured that it expires 2 years after exit day so that nobody can suggest there's an attempt at a permanent attempt to transfer power to the executive. Mr. Speaker, I accept that proposing a delegated power of this breadth is unusual. But leaving the European Union presents us with a unique set of challenges that need a pragmatic solution. Using secondary legislation to tackle challenges such as these is not unusual. Secondary legislation is a process of long standing with clear and established roles for Parliament. The Honourable Lady.
Very, very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Following on from the point made by the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield, the Secretary of State has asked for concrete examples of rights that will be lost to UK citizens as a result of this Act. So I'd like to give him one and ask for his undertaking that he will amend the Act to make sure this right won't be lost. Earlier this summer, a man called John Walker relied on EU equality law to bring his successful challenge to a loophole in UK law that meant employers could refuse to pay same-sex partners the same pensions benefits as heterosexual couples if the funds were paid in before December 2005. And the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, not the European Court of Justice, agreed that there was a loophole in UK law which was a violation of the general principles of non-discrimination in EU law. So Mr Walker was able to use his right of action under the general principles of EU law to close that loophole so that he and his husband can enjoy the same rights as a heterosexual couple. That wouldn't be possible under this bill because, as the Right Honourable gentleman said...
Order. This is a very lawyerly intervention, which is not altogether surprising in view of its genesis. But I'm looking for the question mark.
I'm coming to the question, but the Minister asked for examples. This wouldn't be possible under this bill because there's no right to sue. Will he give an undertaking that he will close this loophole in the bill if we bring forward an appropriate amendment?
I think that will be brought forward in the course of the bill's translation. But if not, I'm standing exactly by my undertaking. If not, she should come to me, and we will find a way of correcting that problem. Now, with respect, we've had one lengthy intervention. I've got to make some progress. Now, our current estimate is that the UK government will need to make between 800 and 1,000 statutory instruments to make exit a reality in UK law. Mr. Speaker, this may seem in some ways like a large number. It's a little less than 1 year's quota, as it were. And I understand members have concerns about the scrutiny of this volume of legislation. But let me contrast this to the 12,000 European Union regulations and 8,000 domestic regulations, 20,000 pieces of law that have brought forward new policies while we have been members of the European Union. This one-off task is very different to the flow of new law we've had from the European Union in the last 40 years, and is ultimately about ensuring that power returns to this House. The people who complain about using secondary legislation should remember, of that 20,000 pieces of law, 8,000 of them went through under secondary legislation. The remaining 12,000 went through without any involvement from this House at all, because they came as regulations. So they were changing the law rather than maintaining the law. Now, all of these changes must happen quickly to maintain stability as we leave the European Union. Many of the changes will be minor and technical, replacing, for example, references to European Union law or to other member states. It would not make sense, nor would it be possible, to make these numerous changes in primary legislation. Some of the changes we bring forward will, by their nature, be more substantial and will demand more scrutiny. An example will be a proposal to transfer a function currently exercised by the Commission to a new domestic body that needs to be set up from scratch. Now, we hope to minimise the need for such bodies, but where they are needed, I readily accept that these changes require fuller parliamentary scrutiny. That's why the bill sets clear criteria that will trigger the use of the affirmative procedure, ensuring a debate and vote on the instrument in both houses. Over the course of the 2 days we'll spend debating this bill, I'm sure we'll hear calls for the secondary legislation to receive greater scrutiny. If you give way for a minute. I'm sure you'll hear calls for this secondary legislation to receive greater scrutiny, which the honourable gentleman has already made, along the lines given to primary legislation. Now, I say to honourable members that I'm clear that the way to make significant changes is through primary legislation, significant changes. That's why the Queen's speech set out plans for several further bills to follow this one, including on immigration, trade and sanctions. Bringing in significant new policy changes is not the task at hand. With this power, we are making corrections to the statute book rather than bringing in new policies to take advantages of the opportunities offered by a withdrawal from the EU. Now, second, these corrections need to be made to ensure we have a functioning statute book. As far as we can see, the power we have proposed is the only logical and feasible way to make those corrections. Our approach remains the only viable plan. We considered others put forward in this House. While we've heard complaints from the benches opposite, we have not seen any alternative. The honourable gentleman was intervened.
Secretary of State for giving way. The central premise of what he's argued this morning is that in order to ensure a smooth exit, we need to maintain as much of the status quo as possible on the way out. But this bill goes much further, because looking at Clause 5 and Clause 6, those changes contained within would effectively rule out being within the customs union and the single market for a transitional period. That is the single biggest risk to our economy, and that is what is contained in this bill.
Well, he is quite right in one respect. That is clear government policy. That is, in fact, what the decision was taken by the British people last year was, that they wanted to leave the European Union, which means leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. That point is clear. I know it's confusing on that side of the House, because the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party appears to have a different view to the rest of the Labour Party. But let me make some further progress after that rather silly intervention. Mr. Speaker, the bill also contains a limited power to implement the withdrawal agreement by statutory instrument if that proves necessary. In a moment, the government's aspiration is to agree a new deep and special partnership with the European Union. Under the Article 50 process, and we are negotiating a withdrawal agreement with the European Union. Provisions of that agreement will need to be implemented in domestic law, and some of that will need to be done by exit day. In a moment. Given the timetable set by Article 50, it's prudent to take this power now so that we're ready, if necessary, to move quickly to implement aspects of an agreement in domestic law. This will be particularly important if the negotiations conclude late in the 2-year period. This power will help to ensure that the UK government and devolved administrations are able to implement the outcome of the negotiations. The power is limited. It will only be available until exit day, at which point it will expire. The power is aimed at making the legislative changes that absolutely need to be in place for day one of exit to enable an orderly withdrawal from the European Union. The Honourable Lady, I think, has
I've listened very, very patiently to the Secretary of State, who is waxed lyrical about these regulations and delegated legislation. It's just standard. It's not just standard. I'd like the Secretary of State to say something about the status of this delegated legislation made under Clause 7. It gives it the status of an Act of Parliament. This is an attempt to oust review by the Court. I'd like him to elaborate upon that very, very important issue.
I'm afraid it's not correct, and this point was made actually by another member. It may even have been the Honourable Gentleman trying to do it in a moment, about the ability to change bits of primary legislation. And the simple truth is that that's a fairly standard set of words used in these legislation. The 2002 Enterprise Act has it in, the 2010 Third Parties Act, both Labour Party acts, and it's the normal routine because you want to make sure that nothing in the bill prevents the ability to go into a transition phase, for example, and into the next phase of the negotiation. Now, the exact, forgive me, I'll make some progress. The exact use of the power will, of course, depend on the contents of the withdrawal agreement. For example, a power could, depending on what the withdrawal agreement says, be used to clarify the status of UK cases at the CJEU that started before exit but were not yet concluded on exit day. It could also be used, for example, to enable regulatory approvals for UK products that were pending at the point of exit, in line with the proposals set out in the UK's position paper on continuity of availability of goods in the EU and the UK this summer. Those sorts of fairly technical but important issues need to be capable of being changed. I'll give way in 1 second to my honourable friend. We have already committed to bringing forward a motion on the final agreement to be approved by both Houses of Parliament before it's concluded. That vote is in addition to the Parliament's scrutiny of any statutory instruments that we propose under this power, and also in addition to the enormous amount of debate and scrutiny that will be applied to the primary legislation that will cover all and every major policy change around our exit from the European Union. So Parliament will be fully involved in taking forward a withdrawal agreement. I give way to my honourable friend.
One of the most offensive kinds of provision that appear in our domestic legislation is the Henry VIII clause, as we call it. Not my words, but the very wise words of my right honourable friend, the member for Stone, in 2013. So there have been long-standing real concerns about statutory instruments for many years right across these benches. So to allay those concerns, would my right honourable friend look at what is called a triaging of these proposed statutory instruments? Many thousands will be completely uncontroversial and can be dealt with very quickly and efficiently. But those which really must be considered fully by this chamber in this place could then happen if we have this triaging. Would my right honourable friend please agree to look at that principle? It will solve many of the difficulties with this bill across all these benches.
I thank my right honourable friend for her suggestion. It won't be many thousands. It's between 800 to 1,000 as the estimates come down from several thousand, because we've taken up much of the most serious legislation in primary legislation, other primary legislation. But I'll happily talk to her about mechanisms for making sure this is a fully democratic and open process, and so I will talk to her about that. And let's come back to it. Well, talk to her about it in the bill process, and talk to her about it possibly changing. No, forgive me, I'm trying to hold back on too many interventions, but I will discuss it with her, and we'll look at possible amendment. Now, I will give way to the chairman of the
State for giving way. On the powers in Clause 9 to implement the withdrawal agreement, is the Secretary of State able to give the House an assurance that those powers will not be exercised until Parliament has had an opportunity to vote on the agreement?
To vote on the agreement. On the agreement, I'm just thinking through the logic of that. It seems to me logical, in truth. I will, if you'll allow me a few moments to review the matter. It seems to me perfectly possible I could give that and take it, but I can't. I won't do it just on the fly in case I've missed something. He's right. No. He's right. He's right. Let me say to the House, he's right about one thing, in that there is the two issues run together. The question of the overall judgment on the outcome and any withdrawal arrangements. Now, the withdrawal arrangements are most likely to come up if it arrives late, and that's why I've got to think through what the possible timetables are. He will remember when we talked about how the House will be able to review the negotiated agreement, that we said we would make best endeavours, we intend and expect that we get it to the House before anybody else does that. That's what we intend. But we had to use that form of words because we weren't sure about timing. But I will talk to him and I will come back to him on that matter. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to move on to another subject, if I may, which is the question of devolution. It relates directly to some of the things the opposition have been saying. Let me now deal with the bill's approach to devolution. As I set out, the overall approach to this bill is to provide for continuity wherever possible at the point of exit, not seek to initiate reforms immediately. That is the approach that guides the devolution provisions as well. Now, let me be clear. This government has a strong track record of devolution. Our commitment to strengthen devolution settlements is clear from the statute book, most recently the Wales Act 2017 and the Scotland Act 2016. Which, if I remember correctly, gave something like 12 billion of tax-raising powers to the Scottish Parliament. So not such small things. Leaving the European Union allows us to make sure that decision-making sits closer to the people than ever before. We expect a significant increase in the decision-making power of the devolved institutions. The current devolution... The current devolution settlements have always created common frameworks within the United Kingdom by reflecting the context of the UK's EU membership. So in areas subject to European Union law, all parts of the United Kingdom currently follow common rules and principles, even where matters are otherwise devolved. For example, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland each pass their own laws relating to food policy, but each nation has to ensure they comply with European Union rules on food hygiene. When we leave the European Union, it's not in the interests of people and businesses living and working across the UK for all those arrangements to disappear, or for there to be new barriers to living and doing business within our own country. In a second. So the bill provides certainty and continuity for people across the UK by recreating in UK law the common frameworks currently provided by EU law and providing that the devolved institutions cannot generally modify them. The bill also ensures that every decision that devolved administrations and legislatures could take before exit day, they can still take after exit day. Mr. Speaker, this is a transitional arrangement. It's an arrangement that ensures certainty and continuity whilst the United Kingdom undertakes negotiations with the European Union on its future relationship, and the UK government and devolved administrations discuss precisely where we need to retain common frameworks within the United Kingdom in the future. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way. What he's therefore describing is not devolution, it's reserving powers back to this Parliament. It's a fundamental breach of the principles of the original Scotland Act. Can he confirm that any statutory instruments, or can he tell us whether or not any statutory instruments that go through this House that affect the devolved administrations will be, as a result of this bill, will be subject to legislative consent in those administrations?
I have said already that we will be putting our overall negotiation through legislative consent motion. That point I made before. But let's just come back to the core of this argument. The argument put here is that everything that belongs to the European Union now belongs to the devolved administrations. So this clearly doesn't work, as we'll come to in a minute. These common frameworks will be important, as they will enable us to manage shared resources, such as the sea, rivers, the air, and enable the continued functioning of the UK's internal market. They will allow us to strike ambitious trade deals, administer and provide access to justice in cases of a cross-border element, and enter into new international treaties. And this includes, indeed, our future relationship with the European Union. Not for the moment. No, not for the moment. For example, they'll mean a business in Wales knows it only needs to comply with one set of rules on food labelling and safety in order to sell to the rest of the United Kingdom. Or that a farmer in Scotland is able to sell her livestock in other parts of Great Britain, safe in the knowledge that the same animal health rules apply across that geographic area. certainty on common approaches is critical. Certainty on common approaches is critical for the day-to-day life of people in the United Kingdom on the day we exit the European Union and into the future. The honourable gentleman was trying to get in on me.
I mean, if this is a smooth transition, I'm not sure how much worse it's going to get, Mr. Speaker. But on the points he raises, and he's making a very good case for the European Union,
yes.
I don't see any reference in here to the immigration powers that Scotland was promised during the referendum process. Can he maybe explain?
I don't remember any such promise. But what was interesting in this, when I was going through the lists of practical things that apply to the citizens that they are supposed to represent, what do we hear? Wow. They don't care. What they're interested in is devolution and political power for themselves, not the interests of their own constituents. So just as important are those areas where we do not need common approaches in the future. We do not expect we'll need to maintain a framework in every single area the EU has mandated. We can ensure our common approaches are better suited to the UK and our devolution settlements, and therefore the bill provides a mechanism to release policy areas where no frameworks are needed. This bill gives time for us to work together with the devolved administrations to determine where we will continue to need common frameworks in future. And crucially, it will not create unnecessary short-term change that negatively affects people or businesses. Before the summer recess, my right honourable friend, the First Secretary of State, wrote to the Scottish and Welsh governments to begin intensive discussions about where common frameworks are and are not needed. In the current absence of Northern Ireland Executive, equivalent engagement has taken place at official level with the Northern Ireland Civil Service. We will bring forward further detail on the process underpinning these discussions in due course for Parliament to decide. Certainly, not for the moment, certainly in devolved legislation affected by the EU exit, certainty is also vitally important. The key delegated powers in this bill are conferred on the devolved administrations so that the task of preparing the devolved statute books for exit can rightly be led from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The government is committed to ensuring the powers work for the administrations and legislatures. For instance, I've already confirmed we will always consult the administrations on corrections made to direct EU law that relate to otherwise devolved areas of competence. I firmly believe that the outcome of this process will be a significant increase in decision-making power of each devolved administration and legislature. It will mean that decisions and power, not for the moment, and power sit in the right place and closer to people than ever before. And crucially, this bill means our UK businesses and citizens have confidence and certainty in the laws that allow them to live and operate across the UK as we exit the European Union. Now, as the Prime Minister said, I've given way to her once. As the Prime Minister said in January, I'm coming to the end of my comments. So, as the Prime Minister said in January, the historic decision taken by the British people in June last year was not a rejection of the common values and history that we share with the European Union, but it was a reflection of the desire of British people to control our own laws and ensure these reflect the country and the people we want to be. This bill is an essential building block for this. It lays the foundation for a functioning statute book, which future policies and laws can be debated and altered. This bill is itself not the place for those substantive changes to the frameworks we inherit from the EU. We will have many more opportunities to debate those, both before and after we leave. Now, I hope honourable members on all sides will recognise that we've acted responsibly in leaving the EU by prioritising, first and foremost, a functioning statute book. In bringing forward this bill, we are ensuring the smoothest possible exit from the European Union, an exit that enables a continued stability of the UK's legal system and maximises certainty for businesses, consumers and individuals across the UK. And as we exit the EU and seek a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union, the bill ensures that we will be doing so from a position where we have the same standards and rules. So in this bill, we're not rejecting EU law, but embracing the work done between member states over 40 years of membership and using that solid foundation to build on the future once we return to being masters of our own laws. I hope everyone in this House recognises this bill's essential nature. It's a foundation upon which we will legislate for years. Now, we've just had this morning the proposals from the opposition on their proposal to move a reasoned amendment. I've just emphasised the critical nature of this bill. A vote for the Honourable Member's amendment is a vote against this bill. A vote for a chaotic exit from the European Union. The amendment suggests that this bill provides some sort of blank cheque to ministers. That's a fundamental misrepresentation of Parliament and our democratic process. Using the bill's powers does not mean avoiding parliamentary scrutiny. Secondary legislation is still subject to parliamentary oversight, using well-established procedures. In no way provides unchecked unilateral powers for the government. On rights, the government agrees that EU exit cannot and will not lead to weaker rights and protections in the UK, as I've just said to the Honourable Lady. We have been clear we want to ensure workers' rights are protected and enhanced as we leave the European Union. This bill provides for existing legislation in this area to be retained. After we leave the EU, it will be for Parliament to determine the proper level of rights protection. On devolution, I've just gone in detail through how we're going to deal with that. And finally, the argument that this bill undermines any particular approach to interim or transitional period for the implementation of our new arrangements with the EU is completely wrong. The bill provides a clear basis for our negotiation by ensuring continuity and clarity in our laws, without prejudice to the ongoing negotiations. Without this legislation, a smooth and orderly exit is impossible. We cannot await the completion of negotiations before ensuring there's legal certainty and continuity at the point of our exit. To do so, or to delay or oppose the bill will be reckless in the extreme. Mr. Speaker, I have in the past witnessed the Labour Party on European business take the most cynical, unprincipled approach to legislation that I've ever seen. They are now attempting to do the same today, and the British people will not forgive them if the end of their process is to delay or destroy the process by which we leave the European Union.
Order. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. I must inform the House that I have selected the amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. I remind the House that, of course, front bench speakers can speak without a time limit, and they have to be sensitive to the number of people who wish to intervene on them. So I merely note, and colleagues can make their own assessment, that on current progress, probably somewhat fewer than half of those who wish to speak today will be able to do so. Colleagues obviously need to help each other. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is keen to portray this bill as a technical exercise converting EU law into our law without raising any serious constitutional issues about the role of Parliament. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, let me start with Clause 9. The Article 50 negotiations that the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister know are among the most difficult and significant in recent history. Under Article 50, the agreement will cover all of the withdrawal arrangements and take account of future relationship between the UK and the EU. A backwards look and a forwards look, and something which may last for decades. We know from Phase 1 it will have to cover EU citizens, Northern Ireland, UK citizens in Europe, the money. Phase 2, of course, will cover security, cross-border crime, civil justice, enforcement of judgments, fisheries, farming, Gibraltar, you name it. We hope it will be in the Article 50 agreement. We want that to succeed. We need an agreement. And of course, it will include our future trading arrangements. Hugely important. Including any transition arrangements, if there are such arrangements, and much more. Arguably, the arrangements will, and these are not my words, but I'll come back to them, extend to every facet of national life. That Article 50 agreement will be voted on, but it will then have to be implemented. A colossal task likely to involve a whole host of policy choices and require very widespread changes to our law on any view. So how will that be done? Enter Clause 9. a Minister of the Crown may by regulations make such provision as the Minister considers appropriate for the purposes of implementing the withdrawal agreement if the Minister considers that such provision should be in force on or before exit day. Well, it's very likely to have to be enforced before exit day, because otherwise there will be a gap. So that means the whole of the agreement being implemented under Clause 9. The whole of the agreement, including transitional measures. It can't be implemented after exit day, otherwise there will be the gap. Let's be clear about how wide Clause 9 is. We've had some discussion about Henry VIII. Let's read subsection 2. Regulations under this provision on the Withdrawal Bill may make any provision that could be made by an Act of Parliament. It's a true Henry VIII. It can modify Acts of Parliament, in brackets, including modifying this Act. The delegated legislation can amend the primary Act itself. That is as wide as I've seen in my experience. What are the limits? You might think, what are the limits? What are the safeguards? Well, Clause 9.3, only these. You can't impose taxation, retrospective provisions, well, they're usually a very bad idea, create a criminal offence, or affect the Human Rights Act. Everything else is on limits under Clause 9. Everything else is on limits under Clause 9. Everything. I will just make this point and then, of course, I'll give way. Surely then, for Clause 9, and I'm using this as an example, you would expect somewhere in here an enhanced procedure, safeguard, surely not just ordinary old delegated legislation. Surely something when it's as wide as this. I'm going to make this point, and I'll of course give way to a number of people when I've done it. What are the procedures? Are they enhanced? No. The opposite. Schedule 7, Part 2, deals with Clause 9. And it makes it clear that unless the delegated legislation creates a public authority or the functioning of a public authority, affects a criminal offence or a power to make legislation, it is to be dealt with by what? The negative procedure for statutory instruments, the least possible scrutiny. So the widest possible power, no safeguards, channelled in to the level of least scrutiny. That is absolutely extraordinary. And let's be clear what that means. Because I'm sure the Secretary of State and others will say, well, notwithstanding the number of statutory instruments under this provision, they could be called up and annulled. Parliament has its say. I looked up the last time a negative procedure statutory instrument was annulled in this House. 38 years ago. I don't know how many people have been in this House for 38 years, but many of us will have not had the opportunity. So much for taking back control. And there's no point the Secretary of State or the Prime Minister saying, well, we wouldn't use these powers, take our assurance. If you wouldn't use them, they're unnecessary. And if they're unnecessary, they shouldn't be put before this House for approval today. I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. The case he's making is for an amendment to Clause 9. He is not making a case against the principle of this bill, which is what second reading is about. And yet he and his party are determined to vote against the principle of the bill. He ought to make that case.
I've only just started. I'll give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State made great play that this bill is necessary for certainty. But given the legal situation that my right honourable friend has just excellently elucidated, would he agree with me that the powers that this gives Secretary of State over regulating every aspect of our lives means that this bill is a charter for uncertainty for ordinary British people?
I would, and I'm going to attempt to demonstrate that. I will press on. I know people want to intervene, but I hear what the Speaker says about the number of people who want to speak, and I will try to take them at intervals if that's satisfactory for the House. The same approach to Clause 9 is taken to Clause 7 for dealing with deficiencies arising from withdrawal, and under Clause 8, complying with international obligations. All of them channelled into the negative procedure with the least possible scrutiny. A giant sidestep of parliamentary scrutiny on the most important issues of our day. But let me top it off. If you think that's bad, and I do, try Clause 17. Try Clause 17. A Minister of Crown may by regulations make such provisions as the Minister considers appropriate in consequence of this Act. That's it. Anything in consequence of the Act can be done under Clause 17. Again, making it absolutely clear, this is a proper, robust Henry VIII. Look at subclause 2, the power to make regulations under subsection 1 may be exercised by modifying any provision made by or under any other enactment. That means amending Parliament. That means amending primary legislation. And this, subsection 3, in case anybody's in doubt, in subsection 2, enactment does not include primary legislation passed or made after the end of the session in which this Act is passed. So it can amend any legislation whatsoever, primary legislation, including legislation in this session. Everything in the Queen's speech that's coming down the track could be amended by delegated legislation under Clause 17. I've never come across such a wide power. I've seen consequential powers. The Secretary of State will no doubt point out other statutes that have not dissimilar powers. I've looked at them. I've never seen one as wide as this. Don't just take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. The Secretary of State a minute ago said nobody could suggest that this was a blank legislative check for the government. Nobody could. Let me read to you the Hansard Society. Not a political body, not the opposition, the Hansard Society. About Clause 17. And I quote, such an extensive power is hedged in by the fact that any provision must somehow relate to the withdrawal from the EU, comma. But given that this will arguably extend to every facet of national life, if it was granted, it would in effect, their words, hand the government a legislative blank check. Hansard's words. I need to just complete this part of my presentation, if I may. A legislative blank check. So what's the scope and extent of this, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, how many pieces of delegated legislation are we concerned with here? The White Paper, as the Secretary of State has said, suggested 800 to 1,000, the vast majority of which will go in the negative procedure route. I don't think the White Paper could or did take into account the further instruments necessary to implement the withdrawal agreement, which could be very many more. Well over 1,000 pieces of delegated legislation with the least scrutiny possible. Now, I will complete this point and then I will give way. I was glad to see the Prime Minister was here earlier. Yesterday, during Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister told the House that, and I quote, the government's approach to this bill has been endorsed by the House of Lords Constitution Committee. That's what she said yesterday at that dispatch box. I went and read again that report last night. I have doubts about that endorsement. But, when I finish this point, but as she and the Secretary of State will know, this morning, the House of Lords produced its further report on the bill, published this morning. It concludes, I quote, the executive powers conferred by this bill are unprecedented and extraordinary. and raise fundamental constitutional issues about the separation of powers between Parliament and government, end quote. It goes on to say, the report that yesterday, or the committee that yesterday the Prime Minister was praying in aid, the number, range and overlapping nature of the broad delegated powers would fundamentally challenge the constitutional balance of powers between Parliament and government and would represent a significant and unacceptable transfer of legal competence, end quote. Far from an endorsement, it's an explicit and damning criticism of the government's approach. I will be fine.
Can I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend for pointing out what a joke this bill is, setting out all these supposed safeguards, but correctly he points out that the ministers can make regulations to modify this act. So we're sort of disappearing down that Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole of legislation. And would he also agree that it doesn't matter when ministers opposite, Prime Minister, the Secretary of State, say, oh, trust us, we won't use these regulations, because they could be here today and gone tomorrow, and the honourable member for the 18th century from Somerset could be Prime Minister. We could be in his hands totally with all of these powers.
Trust me. I'm grateful for that intervention.
I think we can short-circuit this. The honourable gentleman for North East Somerset has often been noted to observe that the 18th century is altogether too recent for him. Sir Keir Starmer.
Wait, twice, because I think there have been two interventions that have been...
Thanks. Could he go back to Clause 9? In relation to what is being called the divorce bill, the amount of money that we may have to pay to the European Union on leaving, exiting the European Union, is it his view that under Clause 9 that could be agreed by a minister, by government, without this place having any say over the amount of money paid at all?
If it doesn't come under Clause 9, it would certainly come under Clause 17. I give way, and I apologise for taking the wrong order. to hear.
Thank you very much for giving way. And as a new member, I also looked at advice on how Parliament has looked at statutory instruments, and I too saw that the last time that instruments were annulled by this House was back in 1979. The issue was actually on the cost of paraffin, and I remember 1979 and the high cost of fuel. It was a significant issue. But given that the Secretary of State has said in response to the intervention from the member from Broxtowe that he is prepared to consider a sifting process, which means that serious issues do come back to this House. What is your alternative? What are you proposing? Thank you. Sorry.
Being made for the first time today. These are the points that have been made since the white paper was published. The moment we dealt with it, that was in March. The bill was published in July. There have been numerous reports since then, and I raised at the time the significant issues that I'm raising now, and there's been no move from the government. I will give way, and then I am going to move on.
I'm very grateful. But the key point about Section 9 is that it allows that the government has asked Parliament to allow it to alter the bill itself by secondary legislation once it's been enacted. If you look through the history of the 20th century, you will not find a single bill that has ever sought to do that. Not in time of war, not in time of civil emergency, and in fact, for every single Emergency Powers Act have expressly said there shall not be a power for ministers to alter the primary legislation.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. It powerfully... I'm on my feet answering the last intervention. It powerfully makes the point that this Act is unprecedented in its scope. It is significant because the Secretary of State will point to some of the safeguards under the Act for the exercise of some of these powers. But if the delegated legislation can amend the Act, then notions of exit day, How far the delegation legislation go, what procedures are used, could be amended by the delegated legislation. So it's a very real point. Mr. Speaker, I am going to press on. I am going to press on. Let me turn from parliamentary involvement to the protection of rights. Many rights and protections derived from the EU are protected in delegated legislation under the 1972 European Communities Act. Because they're underpinned by EU provisions, they've enjoyed enhanced protection, 44 years worth. They include some very important rights. The working time rights of people at work, the rights of part-time and fixed-term workers, the transfer of undertakings provision, which affect everybody who's at work if their company is taken over, so that their contracts are preserved, something we all believe in. All health and safety provisions have been by delegated legislation under the 1972 Act. It didn't matter that it was just delegated legislation because they had enhanced protection because of the 72 Act and because of our membership of the EU. The same is equally true of important environmental rights and protections for consumers. Under this bill, the Secretary of State says they survive, and I accept that, and he does have a commitment to rights at work. But they don't survive with their enhanced status. They survive only in delegated form. From the date of this bill, they are amendable by delegated legislation. All of those rights at work, those environmental provisions, consumer rights, they are protected only, they're unprotected from delegated legislation. I'll give way twice in that order.
On the specific point of health and safety protections, he knows, of course, that there is in fact a 1974 statute, the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act, which gives not just employees safety protections, but also members of the public who are affected by conditions in the workplace. Surely that in itself acts as the primary protection to workers in this country under health and safety provisions.
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. The Manual Handling Regulations 1992, Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations, Health and Safety Regulations 1992, all of which postdate that. And in any event, that doesn't deal with all the other rights that I've I said I would give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech. On the issue of environmental standards, would he agree with me that there's another problem, which is this governance gap? In other words, with the lack of the ECJ, the lack of the Commission, there is nothing to enforce those environmental standards, and therefore we need a new legal architecture. Judicial review is not enough.
I'm very grateful for that intervention, because one thing that is not on the face of the statute is any enforcement provision for rights which are currently enforced in one or other way through EU institutions or even reporting obligations. Now, it's fair to say that there is the provision in the Act for the creation of public authorities by, guess what, delegated legislation, and it may be that could be used for remedies, but it's by no means clear on the face of the bill, and I think that's an important deficiency. But let me just complete this point, because does it matter that these rights have lost their enhanced protection? Well, yes, it does. Taking back control obviously carries with it this Parliament can change those rights, as the Secretary of State rightly set out. But this is to change them by delegated legislation, not primary legislation. That is an important distinction. Does it matter? Would anybody have a go? Surely not in the 21st century. Well, Foreign Secretary, June 2014, calling for an end to back-breaking employment regulations, specifically Collective Redundancies Directive. The International Development Secretary during the referendum campaign, calling for the government to halve the amount of protection given to British workers after Brexit. And the International Trade Secretary, I'm addressing the question whether it's conceivable that a Conservative government might change this. I'm reading out the statements of 3 cabinet members. International Trade Secretary. International Trade Secretary, February 2012, to restore, and I know the Secretary of State heard the quote already this morning, to restore Britain's competitiveness, we must begin by deregulating the labour market. Political objections must be overridden. It's too difficult to hire and fire and too expensive to take on new employees. It's intellectually unsustainable to believe that workplace rights should remain untouchable, while output and employment are clearly cyclical. Now, this Secretary of State has a proud record on human rights and protections of people at work, but these are Cabinet colleagues, and this power in this bill allows these rights to be overridden by delegated legislation. I will give way.
Gentleman for giving way, but isn't there a fundamental contradiction in what he's been saying? A moment ago he was worrying that power would be lost from this House. Now he is saying the power should in fact be with the European Union. Isn't this the fundamental point of this bill? That it is better that laws should be made by our government and our parliament than by an unelected EU bureaucracy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously a very bad communicator. I thought I was suggesting that workplace rights, environmental rights, consumer rights should only be capable of being taken away by primary legislation. If there's any doubt, I can assure the honourable member, I meant when I say primary legislation, I mean legislation in this House. I thought that was taken as read. I give way.
Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. But doesn't the last intervention point to the fundamental misunderstanding that some people have about this bill? And actually, I'm afraid the Secretary of State mentioned it in his intervention. The point is whether the UK is going to become a rule taker rather than a rule maker. Our membership of the European Union has allowed us to influence the directives and regulations which have then been taken on board in this House through our laws. What we are doing in this bill, and I will expand this remarks, is saying we're not repealing, we are reintroducing European legislation into this country, contrary to those who wanted to leave the European Union.
And take back control. I'm grateful for that intervention and agree with it. Mr. Speaker, can I move on to other rights? Because they're dealt with more severely. Clause 5.4 singles out the Charter of Fundamental Rights for extinction. There are thousands of provisions that are being converted into our law and will have to be modified in some cases to arrive in our law. Only one provision in the thousands and thousands has been singled out for extinction: the Charter of Fundamental Rights. As the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield argued in an article published yesterday, the principles of the Charter provide essential safeguard for individuals and businesses, and that has been particularly important in the field of LGBT rights, children's rights and the rights of the elderly. Does it matter, says the Secretary of State, does it matter? Tell me why it matters. I've got here the High Court judgment in the case of David Davis MP, Tom Watson MP and others versus the Secretary of State for the Home Department. It's 2015. The then Home Secretary was the now Prime Minister. David Davis, the backbencher, suing or bringing to court the now Prime Minister. He was challenging, he will recall, the provisions of the Data Retention Investigatory Powers Act 2014. And he was very concerned that it would impinge on the ability of MPs to have confidential communications from their constituents, a point he continued into the debate that we were having a year or two ago. In his argument, he cited the Charter. His lawyers said the Charter was important. His lawyers made the argument that the Charter was important because it went further than the European Convention of Human Rights and therefore was an added protection. I won't read out paragraph 80 of the judgment, which I'm sure the Secretary of State is familiar with. But as he knows, the court found in his favour that that was right. The Charter did enhance his right. And for that reason, it rejected the arguments of Mr. Eady, a distinguished QC. He was the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister's QC. So I'm going to complete this point. So, when he says, will it make any difference? Yes, here's his case. I suspect, if the Secretary of State was still on the benches further behind him, he would be talking to me over a cup of coffee and others about how we fiercely ensured that Clause 5.4 of this bill came out. Let me now. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make progress because I do know lots of people want to come in. I'm going to make progress. I give way.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable gentleman as he makes a very important point. I think, reading the mind of my right honourable friend, why he said does it matter was because he would insist that the general principles of EU law being preserved would replace it. But of course, if they're not justiciable because you don't found a cause of action in our courts, then the ability to assert these rights will of course evaporate.
Exactly the point that my right honourable member made earlier on. To say you can find the right elsewhere so it doesn't matter, and then you remove the right to actually do anything about by an effective remedy, means that you've achieved absolutely nothing through the exercise. I will give way.
Will the honourable gentleman be good enough to explain why it is that other distinguished gentlemen, namely Tony Blair and Lord Goldsmith, fought so resolutely to exclude the Charter of Fundamental Rights from the Lisbon Treaty and furthermore failed because their protocol did not actually work?
No. I spent 20 plus years as a human rights lawyer interpreting and applying provisions such as the Charter, and acted for many people where it made a real difference to their lives, as the Secretary of State will know. Let me move on, Mr. Speaker, to devolved powers. At the moment, EU law limits the powers of the devolved administrations. Upon withdrawal, the default position ought to be that the devolved institutions would have power over things falling within their devolved fields. But Clause 11 prevents that and diverts powers which ought to go to Edinburgh, Cardiff or Belfast to London, where they're to be hoarded. Fundamentally the wrong approach, but totally consistent with the government approach of grabbing power and avoiding scrutiny. On that topic, let me deal with Exit Day, a crucially important day under the bill. It's the day upon which the European Communities Act is repealed. It's the day upon which the role of the European Court of Justice is extinguished in our law. That matters hugely. It matters, whatever your long-term view, that matters hugely, particularly for transitional matters. I heard the Secretary of State this morning say that he did want an arrangement for transitionals which was as close as possible to the current arrangement. I think he knows in his heart of heart that will almost certainly involve a role for the European Court of Justice. He would say temporarily. He knows that. So the exit day, the date on which the role of the court is extinguished, is crucially important. Without it, you can't transition on the terms that the Secretary of State was suggesting this morning, or you might not be able to, and he knows it. Control over exit day is therefore hugely important, Mr. Speaker. Control over exit day. Who has control? Bring back control. You might think Parliament on this very important issue. But no, enter Clause 14. Exit day, 13. Exit day means such day as the Minister of Crown may by regulations appoint. In the sole power of the Minister. Anybody simply passing this bill is prepared to be a spectator on the question of what the transitional measures should be and how they operate. That is a huge risk to our national interest. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. The Secretary of State said it was silly for me to raise this issue early in relation to the transitional arrangements insofar as they may relate to us continuing to be in the single market and the customs union. If this bill is enacted and we're outside of the purview of the ECJ and we are not subject to EU law, then we are effectively ruling out single market and customs union for the transition. How does that give stability and certainty to British businesses? And why is this provision in the bill?
This is the conundrum the Secretary of State and this bill has got into. If exit day is March 2019, then it's very difficult to see how you transition on terms similar to those that we're on. What do? You could push exit day, because it can be chosen, 2 years down the line. Well, if you don't do that, but you want and recognise that the ECJ is necessary, you end up repealing what was once the repeal bill to put it back in again. That is the extent of the absurd powers in this bill. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman for giving way. He's making an outstandingly concise and forensic speech dissecting the difficulties in this bill. And he's drawn attention to the problem with the definition of exit day. Does that problem also feed into the delegated legislative powers? Because Clause 7.7 says that the ministers can make regulations under this section after the end of period of two years beginning with exit day. Now, if exit day is going to disappear down the line, as he has indicated, does that not indicate that the power to make delegated legislation is going to continue for even longer than the government say?
Certainly could. It certainly could. The only way out of that is to have multiple exit days. Now, you might think I'm joking, but somebody who drafted this bill thought of that, because that's conceivable. Multiple exit days, all chosen by a minister, not by Parliament. Mr. Speaker, let me draw to a conclusion. The combined effect of the provisions of this bill would reduce MPs to spectators as power pours into the hands of ministers and the executive. It's an unprecedented power grab. Rule by decree is not a misdescription. It's an affront to Parliament and to accountability. The name of this bill was changed from the Great Repeal Bill to the EU Withdrawal Bill. The word great should have been preserved, but it should have been changed to the Great Power Grab Bill. Labour voted for the Article 50 Act. That's because we accept the referendum result. As a result, the UK is leaving the EU. That we are leaving is settled. How we leave is not. This bill invites us to surrender all power and influence over that question to the government and to ministers. That will betray everything that we were sent here to do. Unless the government makes some very significant concessions before we vote on Monday, Labour will table and has tabled its reasoned amendment and vote against the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesman has just reminded us that this bill was trailed for a very long time as the Great Repeal Bill, which is a very unlikely title. Fortunately, when it comes here, it repeals hardly anything at all, which is one blessing. But one thing it does repeal is the European Communities Act of 1972, which is a particular irony for myself and no doubt for the honourable member for Bolsover as well, as we will remember that act. And I then was a government whip, engineering, mainly by cooperating with the Jenkinsite faction of the Labour Party, how we were actually to get that vote through against the rebellious imperialist Eurosceptics who were then on our backbenches. So it's an irony that a complete mirror image debate now presents itself to me rather many years later. But my starting point is again where the right honourable gentleman just finished. I have to accept that we are going to leave the European Union. I accept that because this House, passed by a large majority the resolution to enact Article 50. I argued and voted against it, but it went through, and it is idle to pretend that politically now it's going to be possible for that to be reversed. But the question now is how we do so. Now, I quite accept the basic premise of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, that technical legislation is going to be required to make sure it is practicable to get a smooth legal transition. I don't think that this piece of legislation confines itself to that aim, as has just been said. The result is that a bill of this kind is necessary, and I think we're going to have to vote for it. But the question is this particular form of the bill remotely acceptable? Now, I studied the amendments put down by the official opposition and indeed by large numbers of other members. And my conclusion was that I found myself agreeing with the overwhelming majority of the sentiments and opinions being put forward in all those amendments. The one thing that gave me a problem was they all begin with declines to give a second reading to the bill, which does give rise to the problem that it would stop any possibility of making the changes required. But I have to say this. Minded as I am at the moment to contemplate voting for second reading, I am going to need some assurances before we get there. In particular, that there is going to be sufficient movement to some of the unanswerable points that are being made about parliamentary democracy and a smooth transition to whatever the alternative is, for this bill to be anything other than a wrecking piece of legislation if it proceeds forward. I could console myself with the thought, I haven't decided yet, I'm actually going to listen to the debate, which is a very rare feature in this House, but I am going to listen to the debate, because, of course, if we were to defeat the second reading, well, the government would be obliged to bring back another bill to try to achieve the same purpose. And if the government isn't going to move in the next 2 days of debate, well, I think we may have to force it to go back to the drawing board and try again as to how to produce a bill which is consistent with our parliamentary traditions and actually does give this House the control that leaders of the Leave campaign during the referendum kept telling the British public they were anxious to see. Now, I hope I'm agreed. I'm not going to give way because there are large numbers of people wanting to speak, and I just want to touch briefly on this time constraint. When we sat through the European Communities Act, I've no doubt the honourable member for Bolsover, like me, sat through weeks and weeks, days and days of very high quality debate. It was a historic moment, and it was not constrained by these Blairite notions of family-friendly hours and tight timetables and all this kind of thing. Now, I don't want to go back to the all-night filibustering and some of the nonsense that led to those practices being discredited. That's not suitable in the 21st century. But this government began the process by trying to argue that the royal prerogative enabled it not even to bring Article 50 before the House, and it's been trying to reduce parliamentary scrutiny and votes ever since the whole thing started. So let me give a first simple example. I raised with the Speaker a few moments ago the question of the 5 o'clock rule. Apparently we've all got to stop at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Well, it would reassure me about the government's intentions if the opportunity was taken to lift it now. The Leader of the House only has to rise at some time in the next hour or so and say the 5 o'clock rule is not going to be invoked today, and all these constraints on time which we're all facing will not be a problem. But I hope the timetable motion for the bill also does not try to confine debate to a comic number of days, because the Right Honourable Gentleman's speech a moment ago has shown how complex some of the debates are going to be. And we don't want all to be told we've got to take part in legal analysis in 5 minutes flat, or be cut out by some quite unnecessary timetable. We've got at least to the end of 2019 to get these procedures right. Now, briefly, there are two broad issues, one of which I will leave alone. It's been dealt with brilliantly. One is, and it's going to dominate a lot of today, which is the Henry VIII clause, the sweeping powers, the extraordinary nature of this legislation. I won't try to compete with what I think, with respect, was the brilliant speech of the Right Honourable friend, the member who leads for the opposition, and I hope in the next 2 days of debate I'll hear some reply. I'm sure my Right Honourable learner friend for Beaconsfield will touch on that, and my own analysis, which I preferred, of Clause 7 and Clause 17, I think is probably not up to the standards that have already been demonstrated. There's no point in repeating the case. I would therefore say one thing to my Right Honourable friend and his colleagues, the Secretary of State, who tried to reassure us that what I expect in response to that. We're told that conversations will be held with my honourable friend, the Right Honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe. I'm delighted to hear that. I'm told that we will have assurances about how ministers are going to use these powers. But at every stage in his speech, as my Right Honourable friend had to, he actually defended the wording he got. And he didn't make the faintest concession, either to the very justifiable concerns about the impact on devolution, or to the even bigger concerns about whether we're going to fritter away parliamentary democracy in this House by passing the bill in its present form. So I have to say, I know my Right Honourable friend is sincere in his assurances. He's one of those people in this House I would trust actually to seek to deliver what he is offering to us. But the reality, as someone has already said, is we're all transient in politics. He will come under pressure from some of his colleagues. We have no idea who will be in office in 18 months' time in any particular post. And the letter of the law will determine to what scope there is for parliamentary scrutiny. So I don't want more assurances, I don't want more charm. What I want is positive amendments, changes to the... and the government will actually salve its reputation on this issue if it takes the lead and produces the amendments which answer the points already made by the Right Honourable and learned gentleman who just spoken for the opposition, and reassures us that the drafting was a misunderstanding, and that better drafting can make it the no policy change, technically necessary bill that I would quite happily support. The second issue, very briefly, is the question of staying in the single market and staying in the customs union during the transitional period. Of course we're going to have a transitional period. Of course it's got to be a smooth transition. Of course by the end of 2019 we're going to negotiate a basis for future free trading arrangements. And I do think that just as the government's got to move, just as the opposition has moved. I made a speech on the Queen's Speech debate explaining why I was in favour of staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, at least for the transitional period, and I then answered the various arguments that are routinely thrown out. And so I won't repeat any of that. But it does seem to me there's only a whisker of difference now. I don't deceive myself that I converted the Labour Party, who now have put down an amendment identical to the arguments I was putting forward, which they didn't then agree with when we were debating the Queen's Speech. But the when I look at the government's proposals, they're remarkably near, because we all know, British business knows, we need this smooth transition. We don't need change until we're certain we have some acceptable new arrangements. I won't read it all out, but I've looked at the position paper on customs arrangements put out by the government. And this says, I will read one sentence, this could involve a new and time-limited customs union between the UK and the EU customs union based on a shared external tariff and without customs procedures. Well, I won't go on. There's an absolute whisker of difference between the government's paper and what the opposition are now saying and what everybody of the slightest common sense, in my opinion, is saying, that we should stay in the single market and the customs union until we know that we can smoothly transfer to some new and equally beneficial arrangement. Again, I would like some reassurances on that. I detect in this wording, and I conclude with it, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to say, I detect in this wording and the proposal and the amendment from the opposition, we're crawling towards that cross-party approach, which is obviously going to be required in the national interest to settle this. It is absurd for the Labour Party to say they're all agreed on the new policy they've adopted. It's absurd for the Conservative Party to say we're all agreed on whatever it is the Secretary of State is trying to negotiate in Brussels. The public are not idiots. They know that both parties are completely and fundamentally divided on many of these issues, with extreme opinions on both sides represented in the Cabinet and the Shadow Cabinet, let alone on the backbenches. Let us therefore resolve this matter. Let us make sure this bill doesn't rule out and make it impossible to stay in the single market and the customs union. Let us have some grown-up debate on the whole practical problem that we face and produce a much better act of Parliament than this bill represents as before us at the moment.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe and in particular the Shadow Secretary of State for two outstanding contributions to this debate. This bill, the whole Brexit process, not only gives an opportunity but requires us to write back to think fundamentally about what we think Parliament is for and what we think democracy is about. The Scottish National Party supports as a fundamental principle the ancient and honoured tradition that sovereignty over the land of Scotland is inalienably vested in the people of Scotland. And that is a principle that is not for sale now, not for sale at any time, or to anybody. This bill seeks to use up and undermine that sovereignty in a number of ways that I'll refer to later in my speech. That fact alone would compel me to vote against the bill when it comes before us for a vote on Monday night. It compels anybody who believes in the sovereignty of the people and anybody who purports to be here on behalf of the people of Scotland to oppose the bill on Monday night, regardless of which party is trying to put them to do something different. Given that it will be the Labour reasoned amendment that is taken, I want to make a few comments on that. We will be supporting Labour's reasoned amendment on Monday night with some reservations. First of all, given that 62% of our citizens voted to remain in the European Union, I'm certainly not ready to give up on that yet for the people. I fully understand and respect the fact that two nations of the United Kingdom voted to leave. I would ask the members of Parliament from those two nations to respect the fact that two nations voted to remain, and those votes cannot simply be cast aside. Secondly, there's a reference in the reasoned amendment to parliamentary sovereignty. Again, I respect the fact that for some people that's an important principle, but that principle does not apply universally across the nations of these islands. I'll give you briefly here.
Is he not aware, is the Honourable Gentleman not aware of the question that was on the ballot that we went to? It was a United Kingdom question. It was a United Kingdom vote. And we voted as a United Kingdom to leave the European Union. That's what we decided. Don't you understand that?
Hey, what about your
seriously the best you could do?
I don't know which part of the people of Scotland are sovereign. The honourable gentleman opposite doesn't understand. The people of Scotland are sovereign. The sovereign will of the people of Scotland is what I will defend. And what I again would urge all members of Parliament from Scotland to respect when the time comes. The final concern that I have with Labour's Hazen Amendment is in reference to a transitional period. I need to make some progress, thank you. I warmly welcome the fact that we now have a lot more clarity from Labour about the benefits of membership of the single market and the customs union. I welcome the fact that they made reference to that in the reasoned amendment. I'm disappointed, given that everybody now knows, the Norwegians certainly do, that there's absolutely no reason why being out of the European Union means you have to be out of the single market. I'm disappointed that Labour have not yet come round to the position that says we should be attempting to stay in the single market permanently after the UK leaves the European Union. But having said that, the reasoned amendment of Labour is a vast improvement on allowing the bill to go ahead unchallenged. So we will be supporting the reasoned amendment from the opposition on Monday evening. Not just now, thank you. It's interesting, if you look at all the reasoned amendments that have been put forward, the huge number of very powerful reasons that different MPs from different parties have come up with for rejecting this bill at this stage. That tells us that there's a huge number of serious and sometimes fundamental flaws in the bill, which mean that it cannot be allowed to go forward in its present format. And if that gives a problem for government timetablers, well, tough. The interests of my constituents are far more important than the interests of the government business managers. I want to look at 4 particular weaknesses in this bill, some of which have been very ably covered already. First of all, there's the act of constitutional betrayal that the bill proposes. It gives a Tory government in London the right to claw back any powers it fancies from the elected parliaments by the 3 devolved nations of the United Kingdom. That's not just a betrayal of those who campaigned for so long, not just now, thank you, who campaigned for so long to have those parliaments re-established. It's a betrayal of the great parliamentarians of all parties under one who have worked so hard to make those parliaments succeed. I'll give way now, yeah.
Thank you. The honourable member talks about representing Scotland. Let us remember that 1 million Scots voted to leave, and in fact 1/3 of SNP voters to leave. So actually, because of their public stats. So what you're actually saying is that if you truly want to represent your constituents, you should respect the democratic will of the United Kingdom, of which you are in this Parliament, and we are all there to do. If honourable members opposite want to be stronger for Scotland, I suggest you engage in the detail of the amendments in the bill, and not trying to create a wedge between the nations of the United Kingdom.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll quite happily see his 1 million Scottish votes to leave the European Union and raising 1.6 million Scottish votes to leave the United Kingdom. Not to mention the 2 million or so who voted to remain in the United Kingdom because he and his colleagues promised unconditionally that was the way to protect membership of the European Union. I'll take no more interventions from people whose position on the European Union has changed so radically over the last couple of years. But let me get back to my comments about the attempt to grab power back from the devolved parliaments for which so many of us worked so hard to establish. Many of those who take the greatest credit for it, for example the great Donald Dewar, are not here to see the success of what they created. I shudder to think what they must be thinking now when they see that the attempts have been made to completely emasculate all 3 of those devolved parliaments.
Shameful. It's absolutely shameful.
It's also a betrayal of the promises, you could almost say the vow, that certain people made to the people of Scotland just 3 years ago. The most powerful devolved parliament in the world, they said. Scotland should lead the union, they said. Parity of esteem and equal partnership of nations, they said. Mr Speaker, what definition are they using? If the Prime Minister who takes their authority from this Parliament decides it's beneath her status even to meet with the First Ministers who take their authority from the respective national parliaments, what definition of equality or parity of esteem are they using, Mr Speaker? Where's the parity of esteem if the Joint Ministerial Council, trumpeted by the Tories less than a year ago as the epitome of good relations between our 4 national governments, hasn't met for 7 months? Although I note that completely coincidental to attempt by my honourable friend from Skylock Harbour to have an urgent debate on the matter, that since then the government have decided that they are going to reconvene the JMC sometime in the autumn, and I hope they won't fall back on the claim that autumn finishes on the 30th of November. So I welcome the fact that they've given way to some pressure and are now going to reconvene it. But the fact is they've done nothing, even ignoring a request by the national governments of Wales and Scotland, a request that they had promised to act on within 1 month. They broke that promise as they've broken so many other promises to the peoples and the parliaments and governments of those devolved nations. I'll happily give way.
Would you agree with me that it would be very simple and straightforward for the government to accept the reality of devolution, and that where there's repatriation of powers from Brussels in devolved areas, those powers go directly to the devolved institutions?
Absolutely. That's what devolution means. If the powers are currently devolved, they should remain devolved. Mr. Speaker, if we can't trust the Tories to keep their word on something as simple as arranging a joint meeting of government ministers, nobody in any of the devolved nations can trust their assurances that the draconian new powers in this bill will not be abused, because our experience of promises from the party opposite suggest that we cannot take them at their word unless the legislation is nailed down so tightly that they can't have any wriggle room at all to go back on their word. We've heard a lot of rhetoric about some issues needing a UK-wide approach. I'm interested to wonder how the UK-wide approach to agriculture and animal welfare and food standards is going to work in Northern Ireland, because regardless of what the legislative or constitutional position was going to be, a matter of business survival is that the food industry in Northern Ireland will follow the same standards that are followed in the Republic of Ireland. They will follow the same standards as apply in the European Union. So we're talking about different animal welfare standards in Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. I can't really see how that is working. But what a UK-wide approach is being shown to mean in practice is that the Prime Minister and a few hand-picked colleagues get the right to dictate to the peoples of these islands and to our elected governments. For example, it was the need for a UK-wide approach that led to Scotland's fishing industry being sold out by the British government when we first joined the EU, and there's a serious danger that the need for a UK-wide approach will lead to those fishermen being sold out yet again as part of the process of leaving. My second concern, Mr. Speaker, is about the all-encompassing power set out in Clause 9, for example, which I think was superbly torn to shreds by the Shadow Secretary of State a few minutes ago. One of the Prime Minister's own backbenchers, right now member for Broxtowe, described this on Wednesday as an unprecedented power grab, and there's no other way it can be described. 649 elected MPs will be expected to stand by and watch while a single minister with a single signature can make new legislation, including the right to make legislation that should require an act of this Parliament. And the only requirement on the minister to be allowed to do that is that she or he thinks the legislation is a good idea. Mr. Speaker, when we have ministers that think welching on the Dubs Amendment and introducing the rape clause were a good idea, I'm looking for a slightly harder test than the fact that a Tory government minister thinks something is a good idea.
Well said.
These new powers have been referred to, Mr. Speaker, as Henry VIII powers. Well, Henry VIII was a despot, no interest in democracy, who thought Scotland and Wales were just places to be conquered and trampled on. So perhaps Henry VIII is not such a bad name for some of what the government are doing. But I think using that nickname hides the danger of these proposed powers. Despite his murderous deeds, a lot of people see Henry VIII as a figure of fun, a kind of pantomime villain that even got to star in his own Carry On film. But the fact of the matter is that the powers in this bill are more 1984 than Carry On Henry. The powers that bear his name are anything but funny. They represent a significant erosion of parliamentary democracy. Indeed, for those members present who believe in the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, the powers in this bill are utterly incompatible with the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. It's not taking back control to Parliament, it's not resuming parliamentary sovereignty. For those nations of the UK where parliamentary sovereignty exists, this bill threatens to destroy it once and for all. The powers are designed to allow ministers to bypass all pretext of parliamentary scrutiny. It's even possible that we could see an Act of Parliament receive the royal assent one day and then be repealed by a minister the next day simply because a minister thinks that's a good idea. The government will argue that delegated powers are an essential part of a modern government, and I agree. We don't have an issue with the principle of using delegated legislation. We do have an issue of allowing delegated legislation to be abused to bypass proper scrutiny. And the only way that this House can be satisfied that the powers will not be abused is if the legislation is reworded to make it impossible for them to be abused in that way. The third significant weakness, which again has been touched on, concerns our membership of the biggest trade agreement in the world. And we're going to throw that away. In Scotland, we're talking about the loss of 80,000 jobs, the loss of £11 billion per year coming into our economy as a result. The figures for the rest of the UK will be proportionate to that, simply to pacify the extreme right wing in the Conservative Party and in their allies, whose obsession with the number of immigrants has blinded them to the massive social and economic benefits that these EU nationals have brought to my constituency, and I suspect to every constituency in the United Kingdom. The sheer immorality of the isolationist, xenophobic approach that the Conservatives are trying to drag us down is there for all to see. But it's not just immoral, it's daft. It threatens to destroy our economy. Already we're seeing key sectors in industry and key public service providers struggling to recruit the staff that they need. It was reported a week or two ago that a private recruitment firm are being offered £200 million just to go and persuade workers to come to the UK to work in our health service. Mr Speaker, I've got a hospital in my constituency that we could rebuild for £200 million quite comfortably, and it's going to be handed to a private firm to try to undo some of the damage that has been done by the government's obsession with the number of immigration. Can also say that with the collapsing pound, meaning British wages are worth a lot less to European workers than they were before, with the anti-European rhetoric and hysteria that we still get from the government benches, and with the government still refusing to give European nationals the absolute unconditional and permanent guarantees that they deserve if they choose to come and live here. Those recruitment difficulties are going to become much, much worse before they get any better. The Secretary of State wants our EU partners to be innovative, imaginative and flexible. I would urge him, Mr Speaker, to apply those same qualities to his government's attitude to membership of the single market. I've mentioned the plight of EU nationals, and another major concern, which again has been raised particularly by the Shadow Secretary of State, is that this bill threatens to undermine the rights not only of EU nationals but of everyone, regardless of nationality or citizenship, who lives on these islands. I hear the promises from the government. We've had promises from this government before. They are not worth the paper they're written on, even if they're not written down on paper at all. Yesterday, at Prime Minister's Questions, we had the usual charade of a Tory backbencher asking a planted question so that the Prime Minister could confirm how successful they'd been in bringing down unemployment. She went so far as to say that unemployment in the UK is at its lowest for over 4 decades. Let's just think about that. The Prime Minister is telling us that unemployment is lower now than it was when it went into the European Union and the single market. How can the Conservative Party, on the one hand, boast about having almost done away with unemployment altogether, and then say that immigrants are to blame for this huge unemployment problem we've got? The fact of the matter is that free movement of people, free movement of workers, membership of the single market has not caused unemployment, it has caused employment. It has benefited our economy, it has helped our businesses to thrive, it keeps schools open in places otherwise the schools would have closed. All the evidence suggests, Mr Speaker, that the most successful, the wealthiest and the happiest countries in the world, those with the highest standard of living for their material or in the things that really matter, are countries that are open, that are inclusive. The government are trying to move us away from that position to becoming one of the most isolationist and isolated economies in the world. There are only 5 countries in the world at the moment that are not part of the trade agreement. None of them are countries that we would want to see as an example. To conclude, Mr Speaker, the government's mantra on Brexit has been taking back control. That's not going to happen, at least not in the way that the people who voted to leave hoped it would happen, because it's not about taking back control to 650 people who collectively hold a democratic mandate from our constituents to represent them. It's about taking back control from this Parliament into the hands of a few ministers. It's about taking back control from the devolved and elected national parliaments and assemblies of Scotland, of Wales, of Northern Ireland, and putting it into the hands of a few chosen members of a political party that can't get elected into government in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland.
Or get a majority.
It allows ministers to usurp the authority of Parliament, gives them absolute power to override the will of Parliament. A lot has been said about the UK government's red lines in the Brexit negotiations, Mr Speaker. I'll give the Minister one red line from the sovereign people of Scotland. Our sovereignty is not for sale. It is not for sale today. It is not for sale any time in the future, not to anyone and at any price. This bill seeks to take that sovereignty from us more than any bill that has been presented to this Parliament probably since we were dragged into it over 300 years ago. That is why I would urge every MP who claims to act on behalf of the people of Scotland, every MP who believes in the sovereignty of the people, every MP who believes in the sovereignty of democratic institutions to vote with us and against the bill on Monday night.